The early morning sun cast long shadows across LaGuardia Airport's Terminal B as Captain Marcus Thompson walked through the sliding doors at 5:45 a.m. His perfectly pressed navy blue pilot's uniform gleamed under the fluorescent lights, four golden stripes on each sleeve marking his rank as a senior captain. The crisp February air had given his dark cheeks a slight flush, and his breath was still visible in small clouds as the warmth of the terminal surrounded him. Marcus adjusted his pilot's cap and wheeled his standard-issue black suitcase toward the crew check-in area. After 15 years with the airline, this morning routine was as familiar to him as breathing. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the terminal's floor in a steady rhythm that matched his confident stride. At the crew desk, Betty, a gray-haired woman who had been checking in pilots longer than Marcus had been flying, looked up with her usual warm smile. "Good morning, Captain Thompson. Flight 2317 to Chicago today." She typed quickly into her computer, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "That's right, Betty. How's that grandson of yours doing in flight school?" Marcus asked, pulling out his pilot's license and company ID. He always made it a point to remember personal details about his colleagues, something that had earned him a reputation as one of the most well-liked captains in the airline. "Oh, he's doing wonderfully. He just completed his first solo flight last week." Betty beamed, her face lighting up at the mention of her grandson. "You know, he still talks about that time you spent explaining the basics of navigation to him during his visit." Marcus smiled, remembering the eager young man's questions. "Tell him to keep at it. We need more passionate pilots in the industry." He meant it sincerely. In his 15 years of commercial flying, he had seen the industry slowly changing, though not as quickly as he hoped. After completing the check-in process, Marcus headed toward security. He noticed a few passengers doing double takes as he passed. Even in 2025, a black pilot still seemed to surprise some people. Rather than let it bother him, Marcus held his head high and offered friendly nods to those he passed. Each surprised look was an opportunity to challenge preconceptions, something he had learned to embrace over the years. At the crew security line, Marcus went through the familiar motions, removing his pilot's cap, placing his bags on the conveyor belt, walking through the metal detector. The TSA agent, Mohammed, greeted him by name. "Another early morning, Captain Thompson." "You know it, Mohammed. Someone's got to get these planes in the air," Marcus replied with a chuckle. The brief exchange was interrupted by the beeping of the metal detector. Marcus's watch, as usual. He removed it, passed through again, and collected his belongings. Walking through the terminal toward the crew room, Marcus checked his watch. 6:15 a.m., right on schedule. He had plenty of time to review the flight plan and weather reports before the 7:30 a.m. departure. The morning crowds were starting to build, with sleepy-eyed passengers clutching coffee cups and dragging their wheeled luggage behind them. In the crew room, Marcus found his first officer, Sarah Chen, already reviewing the weather reports. "Morning, Sarah," he greeted her, setting down his suitcase and pulling out his iPad to begin his own review. "Good morning, Captain," Sarah responded, looking up from her papers. "Looks like we might hit some turbulence over Pennsylvania, but otherwise, it should be a smooth flight to Chicago." Marcus nodded, pulling up the weather radar on his tablet. He had flown this route hundreds of times, but he never let familiarity breed complacency. Every flight deserved the same thorough preparation as his first. As he settled into his pre-flight routine, Marcus reflected on his journey to the captain's seat. From the young boy who watched planes soar over his grandmother's house in Georgia to becoming one of the airline's most experienced pilots, it had been a path filled with challenges and triumphs. He had earned every one of those four stripes on his sleeve through dedication, skill, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Little did Marcus know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. As he finished his weather review and prepared to head to the aircraft for the pre-flight inspection, he couldn't have anticipated the events that were about to unfold. Events that would not only test his professionalism, but would also spark a conversation that needed to be had. At precisely 6:45 a.m., Captain Marcus Thompson made his way toward Gate B-17, where his Boeing 737 waited. His routine was clockwork precise. Arrive at the aircraft 45 minutes before boarding to complete the external inspection and cockpit preparation. The morning light streamed through the terminal's tall windows, creating long shadows behind him as he walked. A new face stood at the gate counter, Sarah Mills, a flight attendant who had transferred from the airline's West Coast division just last week. She was busy arranging boarding passes when she noticed Marcus approaching the jet bridge entrance. Her eyes darted from his face to his uniform, then back again, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to confusion. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah called out, stepping away from the counter. "The economy class boarding won't begin for another 40 minutes. I'll have to ask you to wait in the terminal seating area." Her voice carried that particular tone of authority that new flight attendants often adopt to mask their uncertainty. Marcus paused, his hand still holding his pilot's briefcase. He'd encountered similar situations before, but each time still felt like the first. "I'm actually the captain for this flight," he explained calmly, gesturing to the 4 stripes on his sleeve and the captain's bars clearly visible on his uniform. Sarah's face flushed slightly, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "Sir, I have the crew manifest here, and I don't think—" She shuffled through some papers on her desk, avoiding eye contact. Several early arriving passengers nearby began to take notice of the exchange, their conversations dying down as they watched the scene unfold. "I understand your concern," Marcus said, maintaining his professional demeanor. "My name is Captain Marcus Thompson. You'll find me listed as the pilot in command for Flight 2317 to Chicago." He reached for his airline ID badge, which was already prominently displayed on his uniform. An elderly passenger sitting nearby stood up, recognition dawning on her face. "He is the captain. He flew our flight last month to Boston. Best landing I've ever experienced." Her voice carried across the gate area, causing more passengers to turn and watch. Sarah Mills shifted uncomfortably, still blocking the jet bridge entrance. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor," she insisted, reaching for her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed, aware of the growing audience. Marcus noticed a young black child watching the interaction intently from a nearby seat, his toy airplane forgotten in his lap. The boy's mother whispered something in his ear, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. This moment, Marcus realized, was bigger than just him. "Of course," Marcus replied, his voice steady and dignified. "I encourage you to follow proper procedures. In the meantime, would you mind also calling the lead flight attendant? I believe David Chen is assigned to our flight today." More passengers had gathered now, some openly recording the interaction on their phones. A businessman in a sharp suit stepped forward, his frequent flyer tags jingling. "This is ridiculous. I've flown with Captain Thompson at least a dozen times. He's one of your best pilots." Sarah's face had turned from pink to deep red. Her phone call connected, and she spoke in hushed tones, turning slightly away from the growing crowd. The gate area had become unusually quiet, with only the distant airport announcements and the murmur of whispered conversations breaking the tense silence. First Officer Sarah Chen arrived at this moment, taking in the scene with a quick glance. "Captain Thompson, is everything all right?" she asked, her presence adding another layer of complexity to the situation. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps approached from behind. David Chen, the lead flight attendant, rushed toward the gate, his face showing clear concern. He had worked with Marcus for years and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for the flight's departure, but for addressing the deeper issues that had led to this confrontation. Marcus stood there, straight-backed and composed, knowing that his response would set the tone for what was to come. In his 15 years of flying, Marcus had learned that sometimes the most powerful statements were made not through words, but through actions. As the morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, casting both light and shadows across the gate area, he prepared himself for what would become a defining moment in his career. The gate area at B-17 had transformed into an impromptu amphitheater, with Captain Marcus Thompson and flight attendant Sarah Mills at its center. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, illuminating the growing crowd of passengers who had become unexpected witnesses to the unfolding drama. James Peterson, a marketing executive who traveled this route weekly, held his phone steadily as he recorded the scene. "This is unbelievable," he whispered to his seatmate. "I've flown with Captain Thompson dozens of times." His LinkedIn post about the incident was already drafted in his mind, complete with hashtags about discrimination in the workplace. Near the front of the gathering crowd, Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, a retired schoolteacher, clutched her boarding pass tightly. She remembered Captain Thompson from her flight just last month. How he had calmed the entire cabin during unexpected turbulence with his reassuring voice over the intercom. Now, watching him face this situation with the same calm dignity, she felt her blood pressure rising. "That's our pilot," whispered 12-year-old Malik Johnson to his mother, still holding his toy airplane. His mother, Dr. Lisa Johnson, squeezed his hand tightly. "Yes, baby," she whispered back. "And this is why I always tell you to hold your head high, no matter what." She had already pulled out her phone and was typing an email to the airline's customer service department. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now, their reactions varying from open outrage to uncomfortable shuffling. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others tried to pretend they weren't watching. The regular background noise of the airport, rolling suitcases, coffee shop chatter, distant announcements, seemed muted against the tension at Gate B-17. Sandra Kim, a college student heading home for spring break, live-streamed the scene to her social media followers. "No way this is happening in 2025, she muttered, her followers' angry comments already flooding her screen. The view count ticked up rapidly as more people tuned in to watch the situation unfold. Among the observers, Robert Martinez, no relation to Eleanor, stood out in his pilot's uniform from a competing airline. He had been walking past the gate when the commotion caught his attention. Now, he watched with professional interest and personal concern, knowing this could have easily been him on another day. "I flew with him last week to Denver," a businessman in an expensive suit announced loudly to no one in particular. "Smoothest landing I've ever experienced." Others around him nodded in agreement, some adding their own testimonials about previous flights with Captain Thompson. The regular passengers, those who flew this route frequently, formed a sort of unofficial support group. They exchanged knowing looks and whispered about past flights, weather challenges they'd witnessed Captain Thompson handle expertly, and his invariably professional demeanor. An elderly couple, the Hendersons, who had been quietly observing from their seats, finally spoke up. "Young lady," Mrs. Henderson called out to Sarah Mills, her voice carrying the weight of her 80 years, "I suggest you check that manifest again. Some mistakes are too costly to make in today's world." Near the back of the crowd, two young flight attendants from another gate whispered among themselves, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and concern for their colleague's mistake. They knew how quickly such incidents could go viral, damaging both personal and company reputations. A group of business travelers, initially engrossed in their laptops and phones, had abandoned any pretense of work. One of them, Maria Rodriguez, was already on the phone with her company's travel department, suggesting they review their airline partnership choices. The scene had taken on an almost surreal quality. Here was one of the airline's most experienced pilots, standing with perfect posture and unwavering dignity, while a junior flight attendant's mistake was being documented by dozens of phones and witnessed by scores of increasingly agitated passengers. Through it all, Captain Thompson maintained his composure, aware that his response would be scrutinized just as much as the initial confrontation. He stood there, neither angry nor defensive, but radiating a quiet authority that made the injustice of the situation even more apparent to the observers. The ripple effects of this moment were already spreading beyond Gate B-17. Passengers were texting friends and family, social media posts were gaining traction, and the story was beginning to circulate through the airport's other terminals. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was quickly becoming a powerful commentary on prejudice, professionalism, and the ongoing struggle for respect in the workplace. As lead flight attendant David Chen finally reached the scene, the assembled crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how this modern morality play would unfold. Captain Marcus Thompson stood at Gate B-17, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, but the atmosphere had grown heavy with tension. This was a moment that would define not just his response to prejudice, but potentially influence how similar situations might be handled in the future. David Chen, the lead flight attendant, arrived slightly out of breath. His experienced eyes quickly assessed the situation. The crowd of passengers with phones raised, Sarah Mills' flushed face, and Captain Thompson's calm demeanor. "Captain Thompson," he said clearly, "I apologize for this situation. Is everything all right?" Marcus adjusted his captain's hat slightly, a habit he'd developed over years of flying. When he spoke, His voice carried the same steady tone he used during turbulent flights. "David, good morning. Miss Mills here was just doing her due diligence and verifying crew credentials. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." The gathered crowd murmured at his diplomatic response. Sarah Mills, still clutching her phone, looked both relieved and mortified. The redness in her cheeks had spread to her neck, and her hands trembled slightly as she lowered her phone. "Of course, Captain," David responded, gesturing toward the gate desk. But before they could move, Marcus raised his hand slightly, the same gentle gesture he used when addressing passengers during pre-flight announcements. "If you'll permit me," he said, addressing both the flight crew and the watching passengers, "I'd like to say something." The terminal seemed to grow quieter, if that was possible. Even the distant airport announcements seemed muted. Marcus turned to face Sarah directly, keeping his voice warm but professional. "Ms. Mills, I understand your commitment to security protocols. It's essential in our industry." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "However, I believe this presents an opportunity for all of us to reflect on how we make assumptions and how those assumptions affect our interactions." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The young boy with the toy airplane, Malik, had edged closer to hear better, his mother's hand still firmly clasped in his. "In my 15 years as a commercial pilot," Marcus continued, "I've learned that our responses to challenging situations often teach more than the situations themselves." He gestured to his uniform, the 4 stripes gleaming on his sleeves. "These stripes represent not just rank, but responsibility. Responsibility to lead by example, even in difficult moments." Sarah Mills' posture had changed. Her initial defensive stance had softened, and she was now listening intently, her eyes fixed on Marcus's face. "I propose we use this moment not for division, but for growth," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same reassuring tone he used when guiding passengers through rough weather. "We have a flight to Chicago to prepare for, and our passengers deserve our full attention and professionalism." The crowd's tension began to dissolve. Several passengers lowered their phones, some nodding in appreciation of his measured response. The elderly Mrs. Henderson wiped a tear from her eye, while the businessman who had been recording the incident finally pressed stop on his phone. David Chen stepped forward. "Captain Thompson is absolutely right. Sarah, would you join us in the crew room for a moment? We need to prepare for boarding." His tone was professional but firm. Before following David and Sarah toward the crew room, Marcus turned one last time to address the gathered passengers. "Thank you for your patience and understanding. We'll begin boarding shortly, and I look forward to ensuring you all have a safe and comfortable flight to Chicago." As he walked away, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the impact of his response lingered in the terminal air. Passengers began sharing their impressions in hushed tones. "That's how you handle ignorance with grace," Dr. Johnson whispered to her son Malik, who was still clutching his toy airplane. The elderly couple, the Hendersons, smiled knowingly at each other. "That's a lesson in leadership right there," Mr. Henderson said to his wife. Marcus walked toward the crew room, his steps measured and confident. He knew that his response would be shared across social media, discussed in break rooms, and perhaps even used in training sessions. But more importantly, he hoped it would make a difference in how people thought about their own biases and assumptions. Inside, he felt a mix of emotions: fatigue from having to yet again prove his position, satisfaction at handling it well, and hope that his response might prevent similar incidents in the future. But outside, he maintained the same calm, professional demeanor that had earned him respect throughout his career. Inside the crew room, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the 4 people gathered there: Captain Marcus Thompson, Lead Flight Attendant David Chen, First Officer Sarah Chen, and a visibly shaken Sarah Mills. The room, typically a haven of pre-flight preparation and casual conversation, now felt like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. David Chen broke the tense silence first. "Sarah," he addressed Mills directly, "Captain Thompson is one of our most experienced and respected pilots. He's been with the airline for 15 years and has an impeccable safety record." His voice was firm but not unkind, carrying the weight of his senior position. Sarah Mills stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform, her earlier confidence completely deflated. "Captain Thompson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am so deeply sorry. My behavior was completely unacceptable." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, maintaining her professional composure. First Officer Sarah Chen, who had witnessed the entire scene, spoke up. "You know, Sarah, when I first started flying with Captain Thompson 3 years ago, he taught me something valuable. He said that in aviation, we can't afford to let assumptions cloud our judgment, whether we're in the air or on the ground." Captain Thompson, who had been quietly observing, pulled out a chair and sat down. His action seemed to break some of the tension in the room, and the others followed suit. "Miss Mills," he said gently, "please, sit down. I think we all need to have an honest conversation." Sarah Mills sank into the chair, relief flooding her face at the captain's tone. David Chen pulled out his tablet, ready to document the incident as required by company policy. First, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the same calming authority he used in the cockpit. "I want you to know that I understand this is a learning moment. We all have them throughout our careers." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "What matters most is how we grow from these experiences." David Chen nodded in agreement. "The company will need to document this incident, but Captain Thompson's response and your immediate recognition of the mistake will be noted." He looked at his tablet, typing quickly. "We'll also be implementing some immediate changes to our crew recognition protocols." Sarah Mills wiped her eyes with a tissue offered by First Officer Chen. "I let my preconceptions influence my actions," she admitted. I haven't worked with many." She struggled to find the right words. "Many black pilots?" Marcus finished for her, his tone remaining gentle. "You're not alone in that. In fact, less than 2% of commercial airline pilots are black. But that's precisely why moments like these are so important." First Officer Chen reached into her flight bag and pulled out a crew photograph from last year's airline gala. "Look at this, Sarah," she said, pointing to the image where Captain Thompson stood among his colleagues, all smiling. "Our crew is like a family. We look out for each other, learn from each other, and most importantly, respect each other." David Chen closed his tablet and stood up. "We have 20 minutes until boarding begins. Sarah, if you feel ready, you can return to your duties. Captain Thompson, is there anything else you'd like to address?" Marcus stood, straightening his uniform. "Just one thing," he said, looking directly at Sarah Mills. "Tomorrow, when you come to work, remember this moment. Use it to help others learn. That's how we make real change." Sarah Mills stood, her composure regained, but humility evident in her stance. "Thank you, Captain Thompson. I promise this will never happen again, and I'll make sure to share this lesson with others." "Good," Marcus nodded. "Now, we have passengers waiting for their flight to Chicago. Let's show them what professional crew coordination looks like." As they prepared to leave the crew room, First Officer Chen caught Marcus's eye and smiled. They both knew that while the immediate situation was resolved, the impact of this morning would ripple far beyond Flight 2317. David Chen held the door open as they filed out. The terminal's usual sounds flooded back in, announcements echoing, passengers chatting, luggage wheels rolling across the floor. But something had shifted in the air around Gate B-17. A lesson had been learned, a change had begun, and a group of airline professionals had demonstrated how to turn a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for growth. As they walked back toward the gate, Sarah Mills walked with her head held higher. Captain Thompson moved with his usual quiet confidence, and their fellow crew members flanked them in a show of unity. The morning's confrontation had evolved into something more valuable, a step toward understanding and change. Before returning to the gate, Captain Marcus Thompson gestured for Sarah Mills to join him near the large terminal window. The morning sun had fully risen now, painting the tarmac in golden light as ground crews prepared aircraft for their daily journeys. First Officer Chen and David had gone ahead to begin pre-flight preparations, leaving Marcus and Sarah to have a crucial conversation. "Ms. Mills," Marcus began, watching a Boeing 737 taxi past their window, "would you like to know how I became a pilot?" His voice carried no trace of anger or resentment, only a genuine desire to share. Sarah, still visibly affected by the earlier incident, nodded eagerly. "Yes, Captain, I would really like to hear that." She adjusted her uniform scarf, trying to regain her professional composure. "When I was about 7, Marcus continued, pointing to a plane taking off, I lived near an airport in Georgia. Every day, I'd watch planes soar over my grandmother's house. I'd wave at them, dreaming of being up there. He smiled at the memory. But do you know what my grandmother told me when I said I wanted to be a pilot? Sarah shook her head, completely engaged in his story. She said, "Marcus, baby, I've never seen a black pilot." And she was right. She hadn't. But then she added something important. But that doesn't mean you can't be the first one someone sees. Marcus turned to face Sarah directly. That's why moments like this morning matter so much. Sarah's eyes welled up again. I feel terrible about my assumptions, Captain. I'd never thought about how few black pilots there are, or why that might be. Let me share some numbers with you, Marcus said, pulling out his phone to show her an industry statistics page. Out of roughly 87,000 commercial pilots in the United States, less than 2% are black. When I started 15 years ago, that number was even lower. The terminal bustled around them as Marcus continued. Every time someone like you assumes I'm in the wrong place, it reminds me of all the barriers that still exist. But it also reminds me of my responsibility to handle these moments in a way that creates change. Sarah listened intently, occasionally wiping her eyes. How do you stay so calm when people make wrong assumptions about you? Marcus smiled gently. Years of practice, but more importantly, I realized that my response to these situations could either close doors or open them for the next generation of pilots who look like me. He pointed to a young black girl walking past their window, her face pressed against the glass as she watched planes take off. See her? Maybe she'll be a pilot someday. And maybe, because of conversations like this one, she'll face fewer assumptions about where she belongs. Sarah straightened her uniform, a new understanding visible in her expression. Captain Thompson, what can I do to be part of the change? First, Marcus replied, checking his watch, recognize that biases exist in all of us. The key is acknowledging them and actively working to change them. He paused as another plane roared past. Second, share what you've learned. When you see others making the same assumptions you made today, speak up. I will, Sarah promised, her voice stronger now. And I want you to know that I'll never forget this lesson. Marcus nodded approvingly. Good. Now, about our flight to Chicago, I think we have an opportunity to show our passengers what real professional cooperation looks like. Are you ready for that? Sarah stood taller, squaring her shoulders. Yes, Captain, absolutely. As they walked back toward Gate B-17, Marcus shared a few more stories from his career, the challenges he'd faced, the mentors who'd supported him, and the changes he'd witnessed in the industry. Sarah listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in understanding his perspective. Approaching the gate, they could see passengers watching them, some still recording on their phones. But now, instead of tension, there was a sense of anticipation, a feeling that they were witnessing something important. Remember, Marcus said as they reached the gate, every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce old biases or create new understanding. The choice is always ours. Sarah nodded, a new confidence in her step. The morning's confrontation had transformed into something valuable, a lesson in humanity, professionalism, and the ongoing journey toward true equality in the skies and on the ground. As they prepared to begin boarding, both Captain Thompson and Sarah Mills knew that this discussion would have ripple effects far beyond their flight to Chicago. Sometimes, the most important journeys aren't measured in miles, but in moments of understanding. As Flight 2317 climbed through the morning sky, Captain Marcus Thompson's steady hands guided the Boeing 737 with practiced precision. Dark clouds loomed ahead, promising the challenging weather conditions that had been forecast over Pennsylvania. In the cabin behind him, the passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident sat quietly, many still processing what they had seen at Gate B-17. Weather radar shows significant turbulence ahead, Captain. First Officer Sarah Chen reported, her eyes scanning the instruments. The dark mass of storm clouds on their display looked particularly threatening. Marcus nodded, reaching for the cabin intercom. His voice, when it came through the speakers, carried the same calm authority that had diffused the situation on the ground. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Thompson speaking. We're about to encounter some turbulence over Pennsylvania. I'll be turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, and I ask that all passengers and cabin crew please return to their seats. Sarah Mills, now performing her duties with renewed professionalism, moved efficiently through the cabin, checking seat belts and securing loose items. As she passed row 12, she noticed young Malik, the boy with the toy airplane, watching the approaching storm clouds with wide eyes. The first jolt hit suddenly. The aircraft shuddered as it encountered the turbulent air, causing several passengers to gasp. In the cockpit, Marcus's hands remained steady on the controls, making minute adjustments to maintain the smoothest possible flight path. Dropping to flight level 280, he announced calmly, beginning a gradual descent to find calmer air. The aircraft continued to shake, but his adjustments were so precise that many passengers barely noticed the change in altitude. Sarah Mills, now securely strapped in her jump seat, watched in admiration as the captain she had earlier misjudged handled the challenging conditions with expert skill. Each announcement he made to the cabin was clear, reassuring, and professional. Through the worst of the turbulence, Marcus guided the aircraft with the same calm dignity he had shown during the confrontation at the gate. His movements were deliberate and precise, his communication with air traffic control crisp and clear. First Officer Chen worked seamlessly with him, their coordination demonstrating years of professional training. "Beautiful handling, Captain," Sarah Chen commented as they emerged from the worst of the storm. The skies ahead had cleared to a brilliant blue, and the aircraft's ride smoothed out considerably. Marcus smiled slightly, already preparing for their approach into Chicago. "Thank you, Sarah. Sometimes the roughest patches lead to the smoothest sailing." They both knew he wasn't just talking about the weather. As the aircraft began its descent into O'Hare International Airport, passengers could see the Chicago skyline emerging through breaks in the clouds. The morning sun glinted off Lake Michigan, creating a stunning view that drew appreciative murmurs from the cabin. Marcus began their approach with the same precision he applied to everything in his professional life. The aircraft descended smoothly through the layers of clouds, the city growing larger beneath them. In the cabin, Sarah Mills prepared for landing, her earlier mistake now transformed into a powerful lesson in prejudice and professionalism. The touchdown was so smooth that several passengers later remarked they barely felt it. The huge aircraft settled onto the runway with the gentlest of contacts, a testament to Marcus's skill and experience. As they taxied to their gate, spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin, not just for the smooth landing through difficult conditions, but for everything the passengers had witnessed that day. Marcus's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 9:15 a.m. and the temperature is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for flying with us today." As passengers began to deplane, many stopped to thank Captain Thompson personally. The elderly Mrs. Henderson patted his arm and whispered, "You showed them what real dignity looks like, Captain." Young Malik, clutching his toy airplane, beamed as Marcus signed his junior pilot wings. Sarah Mills stood at the aircraft door, saying goodbye to passengers with a new understanding in her eyes. Each "thank you" from a passenger reminded her of the morning's lessons and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The flight had become more than just a routine trip from New York to Chicago. It had demonstrated how professionalism, skill, and dignity could triumph over prejudice and misconception. As the last passengers deplaned, the crew knew they had been part of something significant, a flight that would be remembered not just for its smooth navigation through rough weather, but for the more important journey it represented. 2 months after Flight 2317, the incident at Gate B-17 had sparked changes that rippled through the entire airline industry. The video taken by passengers that morning had gone viral, accumulating millions of views and prompting discussions about diversity in aviation across social media platforms, news outlets, and airline boardrooms. Captain Marcus Thompson sat in a conference room at the airline's headquarters, facing a room full of eager faces. At the invitation of the airline's executive team, he was leading a new training program focused on addressing unconscious bias in the aviation industry. Among the attendees sat Sarah Mills, who had volunteered to share her story as part of the training. "What happened that morning changed my entire perspective," Sarah told the room, her voice confident and clear. "It made me realize how deeply our unconscious biases can affect our actions, even when we don't intend them to." The room of trainees, a mix of pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew, listened intently. Marcus nodded encouragingly before addressing the group. "Change doesn't happen overnight. he explained, standing at the podium. But it begins with moments like these, when we choose to learn from our mistakes rather than hide from them. The airline had implemented new protocols and training programs in the wake of the incident. ID verification procedures were standardized across all airports, and a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program became mandatory for all staff. But perhaps more significantly, the incident had opened up conversations about representation in aviation. In the back of the room, a young black woman in a pilot trainee uniform raised her hand. "Captain Thompson, your story inspired me to finally pursue my dream of flying. I've had my private pilot's license for years, but never thought I could make it as a commercial pilot." Marcus smiled, remembering his own journey. "That's exactly why sharing these stories matters," he responded. "Sometimes, all it takes is seeing someone who looks like you succeeding in a role to make it feel possible." The training session was being live-streamed to other airline bases across the country. Comments flooded in from staff members sharing their own experiences and commitments to change. The airline's initiative was making headlines in industry publications, with other carriers beginning to implement similar programs. Sarah Mills had become an unexpected advocate for change. Her honest acknowledgement of her mistake and willingness to learn from it had earned her respect among her colleagues. She now helped facilitate discussions about bias and inclusion during new hire training sessions. The most powerful thing, Sarah shared with the group, was seeing how Captain Thompson turned what could have been a negative confrontation into a teaching moment. His response taught me more than any training manual could. After the session, Marcus checked his email to find an invitation to speak at the National Aviation Conference about diversity in the industry. His inbox was full of messages from young aspiring pilots, particularly people of color, asking for guidance and mentorship. In the airline's break room, a new poster hung on the wall showing the diversity of their crew members, with Captain Thompson's quote, "Every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce old biases or create new understanding. The choice is always ours." The impact extended beyond just one airline. Industry statistics showed a marked increase in applications from minority candidates to flight schools and airline training programs. The viral video had sparked a nationwide conversation about representation in aviation, leading to new scholarship programs and mentorship initiatives. First Officer Sarah Chen, who had witnessed the entire incident, was now working with Marcus to establish a mentorship program for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. What happened that day showed us that one moment, handled with grace and wisdom, can create lasting change, she explained to a reporter from Aviation Weekly. As Marcus prepared for his afternoon flight, he passed through the same terminal where the incident had occurred. The atmosphere had changed subtly but significantly. Crew members of all backgrounds moved through the airport with a new awareness and respect for each other. Gate agents and flight attendants had received additional training in professional interaction and bias recognition. Young Malik, the boy with the toy airplane, had written a school essay about that day. His mother shared it with the airline, and it now hung framed in the crew room. "I saw a captain who looked like me. Now I know I can fly too." The incident at Gate B-17 had become more than just a viral moment or a training example. It had become a catalyst for real change in an industry that needed it. As Captain Marcus Thompson prepared for another flight, he knew that sometimes the most important journeys aren't the ones that cross continents, but the ones that open minds and transform hearts.